Welcome to Savage Minds. I'm your host, Julian Vigo. Today's guest is Katherine Deves, an Australian lawyer, mother of 3 daughters, and co-founder of Save Women's Sports Australasia, that defends the rights of women and girls to a dedicated female-only sports category. A member of the Liberal Party in Australia, Katherine was selected as the candidate for Warringah in the 2022 Australian federal election. She was ultimately unsuccessful in her bid after being subjected to attacks due to her views on gender identity ideology and prior advocacy for women and children. I welcome Katherine Deves to Savage Minds. I'd like to kick off with the reason why we've waited until now to speak, because you recently stood for political office as you were selected as the candidate for Warringah in the 2022 Australian federal election. You were lambasted as a bigot, you were called insane, but there was a light at the end of the tunnel in the fact that your campaign ended up doing what the feminists call piquing many Australians as to the gender identity madness. Could you talk about what you went through as a candidate and what happened?
So I was selected as the candidate for Warringah, and it didn't get off to a good start in that I was what they called a captain's pick. So the Premier of New South Wales, the Prime Minister, and a very high-level woman within the party, the 3 of them selected candidates for particular electorates. So I'd been planning on running in a plebiscite, which is where all the members of the party within Warringah would be able to cast a vote to select the candidate. So before we'd even gotten started, there was a whole lot of people who would normally participate in the campaign who were offside and disillusioned and didn't want to help. And I understand that because they really, really wanted the plebiscite. So I was the captain's pick, and we had literally had 6 weeks to get to election day. So that was an extraordinarily short period of time. We lost 1 week to the Easter holidays where pretty much nothing happened. And then there was 1 week where the media furor around me was at such a level that I had to send my family away. I literally had to just go and take cover at my friend's house, which was out of the area, and just wait for it to die down. So what happened was I was running as the Liberal candidate. I was running, so this is big L Liberal. Our sort of centre-right party is called the Liberal Party, so figure that out. And I was running on their campaign platform. However, I had, as all candidates are told to do, closed down any social media accounts, personal, work-related, etc., because you are now the candidate, you are speaking for the party. So anything you've done prior needed to be, taken down. So I did that. Unbeknownst to me, there was a hacker by the name of Travis Brown, who is located in Berlin. I believe he's involved in the Twitter open source program. He had, what we think is that he had set up a bot to capture any tweet that I made at the time. I published it, and he put that into a file and made it available on GitHub. So it came to my attention that there were people dropping tweets on Twitter and social media from this account that I had closed down. And somehow the GitHub file had gotten into the hands of some journalists here in Australia. One in particular, her name is Samantha Maiden. She works for news.com.au, and she was just dropping these tweets it almost felt like every few hours, basically just taking a tweet that had, words in it that were very controversial and confronting without any context. If this was in a debate that was being had on Twitter or part of a series of tweets, she'd just take one of them and drop it. And so the headlines were turning into, Katherine Deves said that trans kids are surgically mutilated and sterilised, without actually looking at the argument that I was trying to prosecute.
They misrepresented your words? How odd. I mean, this is the MO of these folks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. But, I had people around me saying, how much more is there to come? And I'm like, well, I don't know. I've been doing this for 2 years and I don't know what they're going to find offensive. because, they were saying, oh, there's 6,000, transphobic tweets. And I had a friend actually go through the GitHub file, and she said, most of that stuff, Kath, you're just whittering on about living in, the community that you do and talking about women and children's rights. And, they've sort of taken the most inflammatory ones and they're just dropping them like bombs. So that was really hard, because I was also in the position of being the Liberal candidate. And while you're allowed to do as much local press as you want, you have to run requests for national press through headquarters. And they did not want this debate to derail what their main messages were, which is stuff to do with the economy and national security, which I completely understand. So I didn't really get the opportunity to respond to many of the media requests that I had. And I think in hindsight, had I just been able to, go on the morning breakfast show and they said, we want to ask you about trans, but also about yourself and the platform that you're running on, I think it could have really taken some of the heat out of the debate, because I was seen to just be running away from the press, which, it did give the impression, because when you're sort of not responding to media inquiries, or headquarters are just saying, no, she's not doing that, it made it really difficult. And it was also not the platform that I was running on. Like, obviously I'd become known for speaking out about women's sports and the men who want to compete in that category, but that wasn't my main issue. And so the media, I mean, you can imagine they had a field day. So the ABC and SBS are two big platforms here that are actually government owned, and they are very captured by trans ideology. And a lot of other platforms here, the commercial TV stations and radio networks and so on, are quite captured. But then there were also other people who came out in defence. So I think, in hindsight now, when I talk to people started to, like, I was so vilified. It was so extreme. I think I was the most reported on candidate, second only to the Prime Minister. And it just became so intense. And the fact that I ended up having to get 24/7 security and so on and so forth, that I think people started to see through what was going on and just saying, well, what is this lady saying that's so terrible? And then if you actually go and have a look and do a bit of research yourself, you find out that my arguments, were just about women and children and women's rights and how gender identity ideology is impacting us.
Right. Well, you have just mentioned several terms that are very transphobic. I just want to highlight this. You said he, you said men. This is the bar of what transphobia is. And just last week, I had Leor Sapir on the show, and we discussed in depth. The show is 2 hours, because we discussed in depth the ideological backdrop to this. In fact, he pushed back a bit on me saying ideological, but then he went with it, because what can you call something that's not based in reality, but it isn't quite a religion? We'll get there. And that looks very much like one, however, if not a cultish belief system, to then overturning every single woman's right that has allowed our female ancestors to leave the house in the 19th century onward, and to be able to use loos, because loos that were made specifically for women, they did not exist until modern history, pretty much. And the same thing, education. When you start to look even in places like India, why girls don't go to school. Many people are not aware. The number one reason why girls are not going to school in India has nothing other to do than the lack of toilets for girls. And people are not aware of this. So you've got this trans ideology, which has firmly implanted itself amongst the neoliberal classes of India, and is taking aim, unfortunately, at the Dalit class. And then you have what you've been through, having to send your family away. In 2013, when I published my first piece with Counterpunch, I had to leave the country for 2.5 months. It was awful, with the death threats, with the Met Police saying, we lost your file. And I had to employ private barristers to send sharply worded letters to just a few of the over 100 people who sent myself and my editor death and rape threats directed at us and our daughters. Now, I think a lot of people in Australia, and just like in the UK, and just like all over the English speaking world, they've been, I call it the slowly boiling frog treatment from media. They have been trained to say she. And I'm going to go to an article that was written about you, because there are many hit pieces that are directed at any woman in the public eye who speaks out. And you are not exempt from this. Out in Perth, one can only assume, I went to the website, rainbow flags galore, a man that has long hair discussing something to do with a smear test, bizarre, has run hit jobs on gender critical women such as yourself. And the piece that I'm referring to is entitled Katherine Deves, Pride is a Neo-Religion with No God. And the piece describes you as such. Deves, who is also the head of Save Women's Sport Australia, a body that campaigns against transgender people participating in sport, against cisgender people, ... Now, the language of this resembles very much that of pink news, or what the feminists call penis news in the UK, that takes aim at women, anti-trans, wants to murder trans, wants to eliminate the existence of trans people, deny their rights, blah, blah, blah. All the hyperbole that is, in fact, not at all what any of us have said. I have yet to encounter one woman who is saying this, right? And this is just one of many articles that has hit out on you. When Australians read stuff like this, or in the gay community specifically, because we in the gay community, we were slowly boiled before everyone else. I remember in the 90s, late 90s, looking at all the propaganda near the toilets about trans women, and I was like, what is this doing in a gay bar? What does this have to do with us? Because being gay has nothing to do with having a psychological condition. And of course, they don't like that we say that, but there's a paradox there as well, because they say they have one until they say they don't, and then we're bigots, and the argument keeps shifting goalposts. So how is it that the Australian public, especially the gay community reading out in Perth, can understand the severity of what is being done, not just to women's rights, but to their rights, our rights as gay men and lesbians, to be able to say, no, I'm not going to suck a female penis. Thank you very much. I pass.
Oh, look, the language that they use, that ideological language that proliferates everywhere, that is why I just simply refuse to use it. When they say, oh, you're trying to ban trans people from sport, or trans girls from girls' sport, I'm like, no, I'm saying that females are entitled to a dedicated female-only sports category. I'm not saying if you want to identify as trans, whatever that means, you should be able to play sport. Of course, we all understand the benefits, but if you are not female, if you're not born female, and I'm not talking about people who go and change their birth certificate because it's a polite legal fiction, you should be able to have your own sports category for the girls, for all the obvious reasons that we all know. And I find it absolutely ludicrous that we have to go and do all this research to prove that men, are stronger, bigger, faster than women. But for trans people who want to play sport, they should be going into the open or mixed category or the male category. I have no issue with that. And also, when they're talking about and we all have to use the pronouns of I refuse to do it, because that's not what I see with my two eyes. I have some friends who are actually trans, and I would not ever do anything in front of them to upset them. I use their name, and I will be polite. And this is one of the difficult things I found with what happened in the election as well, is because from the beginning, I grew up with a gay sibling. I've got cousins. I've got, I officiated at a gay wedding at Sydney Opera House the other weekend. I have no issue with it. I never have. Like, gender non-conformity, grow your hair, wear a dress, wear the makeup. Honestly, don't care. Like, bring it on. More color, more experimentation with that sort of stuff. I have no issue with that. But obviously what I have the issue with is that a man putting on a dress and growing his hair, it doesn't make him a woman. And I'm never going to resolve from that position. And it offends me on a visceral level when these men say, well, I'm a woman now and I'm going to come into your spaces, come to your female only events, I'm going to take your resources, I'm going to come into your sports and your toilets. I say no to that. And I've got 3 little girls and I will never stop fighting because they have the right to, female only sports and spaces and resources and scholarships, because they have the right to have, opportunities equal to men in the public sphere. And the only way we can do that is by ensuring that they have certain things that are dedicated just for females. And I'm never going to stop fighting for that.
Brilliant. I completely agree. In the early noughts, when this nonsense started coming about in New York, queer was used a lot, and people were saying, I'm queer, and it was a way of not saying gay, okay? It didn't mean what it means today, FYI. But I didn't use it. Then there was a certain point where I tried out the word and I felt sort of stupid using it because I didn't run around calling myself anything, really. I didn't run around either saying I'm gay. Well, I used gay more than lesbian. I had to get used to the British women saying lesbian, and some got upset with me that I would say gay, and that's just an Americanism. Okay. I also agree with every single thing you've said. And in fact, I postulated the other day with Leor, if myself and many other women had stopped trying to appease this movement, because I did have friends who were trans in the early 90s and I would use their preferred pronouns. And I regret that. Not because I'm a mean person. I just think my reality matters as much as theirs. And when they look in the mirror and they see a woman, that's their right. But it's also my right not to be their mirror. And it's also my right not to play this kind of unelected role of psychotherapist to their needs. And I don't have that duty to anyone. Just like in other subjects, I don't have that duty. I'm not going to go running around declaring that the universe is not heliocentric, or like the flat earthers, I'm not going to proclaim that the earth is really flat and show my little model I've made out of clay. I think we have a duty to respect each other in democratic rights. But this is the one movement that I've seen in my lifetime whose democratic rights seek to undermine those of half the population, and that seeks to use us, women specifically, never men, as their mirror. On social media, often I'll write, I am not your mirror. And when I say to this is, I'm referencing 2 things. One, the American photographer Nan Goldin had a book of photography in the 80s called I Am Your Mirror. And it was about her reflections with the transvestite community in New York's East Village, briefly.
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of friends who are transvestites, who are drag performers. Love them. They're on my Facebook page. They're constantly posting. Wonderful people. They know they're men. And yes, I understand, which I didn't understand in my 20s, a lot of the feminist assertions and arguments against the misogyny within transvestite shows, let's call them that. That's another argument there altogether, because the one saving grace of trans shows on the stage is that, again, everyone knows they're men. There was something about the 90s as the last bastion of being able to say that these were men that's a relief to me, because no longer. Now you have to hem and haw, and you have to think, even sometimes when I'm with guests who are very different about the trans issue, even though they recognize the nuttery, they still use preferred pronouns. And I had one guest who was very nervous about my saying he. And I could tell. And he's, I just want to say that I am, and that's a hard thing to struggle with, because you're in front of a man who has no skin in the game. You have a man who has no daughters in the game. A lot of men who get it are the men with sisters and daughters, are the men who were sexually assaulted as children, you see. Hence, the recent revelations about mermaids. Men are coming out of the woodwork, including gay men, and gay men who are very aware that there was a tie-in to the ideological pushback against public acceptance of homosexuality, because people called them pedos, right? So they are very aware that the last thing they want is that the LGBTQ alphabet soup nonsense is attached to that, and they want out, because they saw this coming a long time ago, where many of these figures have pedophile criminal records. So it's a hard thing. And then you're running for a party that you described as center-right, correct?
That's correct.
Yes, I imagine a lot of the pushback also came trying to paint you as some kind of Nazi figure.
Yeah, as a right-wing bigot, I think. But look, I've always, my partner, he runs a small business. I come from a family that's always voted Liberal. That's just where I would say my political home would be. I'm quite conservative with relation to like economy and finance and things like that. But, I voted for same-sex marriage. I'm pro-choice. I'm common law with my husband. So I'm sort of not your traditional conservative. But it seems to be the Conservatives are recognising, continuing to recognise biological sex. And then it's the other parties here like Labor, which is the centre-left party, and the Greens, and also a group of women who are independents who are called the Teals. They're on side with this ideology. So it just made sense to me, when I rejoined the party. I'd been a member in years past, and I rejoined the party because I thought they had a bit of an understanding of this issue. And there was a senator here, Senator Claire Chandler. She put forward the bill called Save Women's Sports, which would have provided for a dedicated female-only sports category. So I thought that people within the party room were obviously realising there's an issue with the ideology. However, some of my biggest detractors during the campaign were actually men within my own party who went out in public, and portrayed me as bigoted or transphobic or whatever. And, I tried to reach out to one who was running in the electorate next to mine. And I thought, look, we've got bigger battles against the Teals in our area. Can I at least, and he's a gay man, I said, can we at least have a conversation? And can I explain myself to you? And I never got a response. So here with the political landscape, I was going to say, what really concerns me about this ideology is the sanctions. And we have laws that are being imposed here that do attach, criminal and civil sanctions to not going along with the ideology. So even here in the state of New South Wales, where I live, there's something called transgender vilification in our anti-discrimination law. And you can be criminally charged for, vilifying a transgender person. So there's actually a statutory defence to that, which says, if it's in the public interest or you're discussing, an issue that should be of interest to the public. But it's only going to be a matter of time before, the trans activists come after someone and level that charge. And even if they are able to rely on the defence, as we know with a lot of this, the process is the punishment. With respect to legislation here in Australia, we've also got gender identity as a protected characteristic at a federal level. So nothing's actually been run through the courts that I'm aware of with respect to discrimination on the basis of gender identity, but there are complaints that are brought to the Australian Human Rights Commission. And when you look at, so the gender identity protections are in our Sex Discrimination Act, and that was enacted back in 1984 to give effect to Australia being the signatory to the UN Convention for the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. So essentially that means that women should not be discriminated against on the basis of their biological sex in the public sphere.
And in 1984, did they include transgender identity?
No, so it was just sex at that point. But in 2013, they made some amendments, some very sneaky amendments. And they put in gender identity, which is based on the definition is that ridiculous one from Yogyakarta. They also put in intersex, and they also put in a sexual orientation. So in my view, those three categories, it's actually unconstitutional for them to be in that piece of legislation, because the way that it works is the legislation is effective because it relies on a head of power, which we find in the Constitution, and the heads of power are all listed. So the Sex Discrimination Act relies on the head of power that pertains to external affairs, and that means treaties. So we were signatories to CEDAW and a number of other UN treaties. So to give effect to, because the Sex Discrimination Act was relying on giving effect to those treaties, it's constitutional. So that's all fine and well and good. But in 2013, when they put in these three categories, none of those treaties refer to gender identity, sexual orientation, or intersex. So there's no basis for them being there. And we've been waiting for a case to be run. We were hoping that a case was going to be afoot called, you'll love this, it was going to be called Giggle versus Tickle. This was between Sal Grover, who has an online social media platform called Giggle, and she only allows biological females on there. It does very well in countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, where women really are restricted in what they can do. And Tickle was a person by the name of Roxy Tickle. He is a male who says that he's a woman. He claims that he's changed his sex on his birth certificate. And you can do that in the state of Victoria. So he might have done it, I'm not sure. And he was upset that he couldn't get on this platform. So he was going to sue Sal Grover and Giggle for discrimination on the basis of his gender identity. And her argument was, well, I'm saying that women are allowed to have spaces on the basis of their sex. So you're excluded on the basis of your sex. And also the provision that you're trying to rely on, gender identity, is actually unconstitutional. So we were all really looking forward to that case, because you couldn't, I mean, Giggle versus Tickle as the definitive case to protect women's sex-based rights. You couldn't make that up for a movie. But Tickle withdrew his complaint. So I'm not sure if someone advised him that it was likely to be a losing proposition, or that if he lost, he would be ruining protections for gender identity, also with sexual orientation. Now, don't get me wrong. I think that people, gay and lesbian and bi people, absolutely should be able to live lives free from discrimination. And it's a pity that they put it in with gender identity. I think that they absolutely deserve their own legislation to be protected, but it needed to be done in a different way.
It also collapses this notion that discrimination is your or my saying he. And there's a huge difference. In fact, I have to say, this movement has made me change my mind about the infamous gay wedding cake case in the US. I'll be honest, I used to think, oh, that's discriminatory. Now I'm like, no, if they don't want to make my cake, let them not make my cake. There'll be other people who want my money. And that's a crazy answer. It's almost a capitalist answer from me, but it's answering to the madness of this affirmation of what I stand for. And if you really don't want to make my wedding cake because you really think I shouldn't marry my wife, then I'll find someone who doesn't care about if I'm marrying a frog, a man, or whatever, or myself, as per Sue in Glee. Now, I hear you. This is a really crazy moment where, and in fact, in that article that was trying to do you under, it said something that I agree with, that you said, that pride is a neo-religion with no God. And obviously, I never read anything about you and thought, oh, she's homophobic. Never. In fact, a lot of people on the right, including in the US right, I have to remind feminists all the time when they argue against collaboration with the right, is a lot of right-wing Americans are actually pro-gay. There's a lot of right-wing Americans who are just fiscal conservatives. So if you run with that and you stop thinking that everyone who votes on the right is a racist who wants immigrants to die in camps, all the myths associated with the right are sort of worn in 2022, especially since what we've seen go down in Melbourne during lockdown. I have to specify that because that's a real eye-opener if you thought the left was progressive. Anyways, I'd have to say that your thought of this being a neo-religion fits in with a lot of what I've thought over the years. In fact, later this week, I'm going to be interviewing a cult expert on this very subject, because many people have asserted that this is just mass capture. It's a cult, and it's a cult that's aided and abetted by online presence. People, a lot of whom don't have any in real life social life.
I think so. Sometimes I think this is like Revenge of the Losers. People who didn't have friends at school, but they've got social capital online, and they can lash out at, people they don't like, and get rewarded for it, and lauded and feted and all the rest of it. I mean, the trans activists, they hold all the cards on the social media platforms. so I do understand what you say, what you mean when you say that. And, with respect to gender identity being a religion, it's secular religion because there is no God. The God is yourself. It is your, curated identity that's online, and it can be, depending on who you're speaking to, it can be fluid, it can be innate, you can be born with it. The goalposts are constantly shifting, but with these laws that are coming into place, particularly here in Australia, if you don't go along with it, if your child comes home and says that they're trans in the state of Victoria and you don't go along with that, you can be guilty of a crime. You can be guilty of a family violence crime, and the penalties are extraordinary. It's up to like 10 years imprisonment. Even organisations can be captured by the legislation, and I think the fines for an organisation can be up to $1 million. So, you run through a few scenarios. Say you're a married woman, you've been married for 30 years, suddenly you've got your husband who's been watching too much trans porn. He decides that he wants to be a woman, and you don't affirm him. He can have you charged with a family violence offence. This is where we're at in Australia. It hasn't happened yet, but I suspect it's only a matter of time. And it's like this state-sanctioned religion. But what I find really disheartening about it all, I remember having this moment in the election when things were really bad, and I got into the car with my friend, I don't know where we were going, and I just was, beside myself and completely distraught. And I said, the thing with this ideology is it's so impoverished. There's no joy. It feels like everything is a sanction. People are walking on eggshells. They're not producing music. They're not producing art except horrible, killed turf, weird fetish anime. Like there's no singing, there's no community except, being caught up in the cult where you have to obey all these rules. And the minute you step out of line, you are punished and you are excommunicated. I said, it's merciless and it's heartless and it's brutal. And there's no joy. And I said, and this is what we're fighting against. And, the fact that people are just going along with it without really understanding. And I think it's not until people come up against it in their own life. Their daughter has to play netball against some 6'3", 15-year-old bloke, or you put grandma in a nursing home and you ask for females only to provide intimate care, and you've got some bloke trying to give her a bath, and grandma's distraught. So many people, I think, just go along with it just because they don't understand, or because they really are afraid of being criminalized, losing friends, losing family, losing jobs. Like so many women are losing jobs or being kicked out of social groups, kicked out of things online. I mean, I've lost friends. There's a member of my family who won't really speak to me. Our relationship has become extremely impoverished because of this. So there are really high social costs to this. But at the same time, I think, this is an existential threat that we are trying to hold the line against. If we can upend the meaning of man and woman, and we can take away what it is to be a mother, for instance, and pretend that everything is the same, and just whatever you say you are, that's the most important thing, then I think, we're getting into very, very dangerous territory if we become, I think Colin Wright says this, untethered from reality.
And it's very 1984, because if Newspeak is to take over, and we saw this even during lockdown, people did not question anything. And people who questioned were called anti this, anti that, in the same way that transphobia is meaningless. And I assert that transphobia is a throwaway term at this point, because I think trans is a fiction. And I say this with all respect to the people I know in my life who identify as transgender, but these are medical fictions. They were medical fictions that emerged, not coincidentally, during the height of the most sexist decade of the 20th century, the 1950s. As I said to Leor the other day, the 1960s didn't come from nowhere. And there was a reason for the social revolution. I'd have to say, adding to this, you went through how the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984 was amended in 2013 to include gender ID. but you also say that there's gender ID, then there's transgender, and never the two shall meet, right? No one can really define either, because both are whatever you want it to be. And Katherine, I dare say, you're looking mighty gender nonconforming today. Where is your Laura Ashley Prince? You know, you've got that Snoop Dogg head thing on. No, I'm making fun here a little bit, just because I've always said this. Everyone's gender nonconforming. And I mean, if Zsa Zsa Gabor were here, I'd go through what she's wearing. But no one is really completely gender conforming, not even the super effeminate women or the super macho men. This is a myth spun by, and uniquely by at this point, this lobby. They like to make you and I second-class cis women. And you've seen this if you followed that idiot Katie Montgomery in the UK. He loves to run around saying that I'm a better woman than you. Well,
Really,
yes, that's
Katie?
the ultimate. Yeah, that's the ultimate misogyny in a sense, because even I wouldn't claim to do a better woman than any other woman. Like this is what men say to each other. This is. And not even all men. We should bracket that there's a lot of good men out there in our support who know very well that Katie Montgomery is not only a dude, but that he's a misogynist in drag. If I write that on Twitter, my Twitter account is bye-bye. I've seen dozens and even hundreds, because I started to think about it the other day when I said dozens, of women who've lost their accounts. The better known names like Meghan Murphy, we've known about for years. She took Twitter to court, lost. But I think we're going to see other such cases when you have major tech companies in the big tech world like Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and so forth and so on, that are controlling not just public speech. As Kelly J said to me one day, when you can control the way people speak, you are actually trying to control their thought, because we speak in order to walk through our ideas, right? Even as you and I are speaking, sometimes, like I've got some notes here, but I sometimes think, oh, well, what, you know, I'll elaborate this thought in a different way because I'm not quite fond of what I've written here, and I work it out. In fact, I'm attracted to people like Leo. I invited him on because he had an article that just blew my mind away, and I thought, this is the problem. When I sit down to write about this, I'm sure this happens to you. Sometimes it's just so crazy making, and you just want to write F words. And you come across someone that's put it very well, and you're like, that's what I wanted to say. And Kelly J did this as well. She was one of the first who saw that this was about containing and controlling not just the use of the word woman, but the way women think and speak. This is the nasty part of it all.
Yeah.
I want to just hit back on the way that in Australia, gender ID and trans is undefinable as it is everywhere else, that you and I could just say we're trans. Like, why not? We can be Victor Victoria. I've always posited this. I'll be like Julie Andrews, pretending to be a man, pretending to be a woman. Which am I?
Well, you know, you look at the rainbow, the LGBTIQA++, and as you pointed out, you know, by their definitions, as impoverished as they are, I would absolutely qualify for being queer or lesbian. You know, I've been with women before. I've always been quite gender non-conforming with my clothes. I mean, I was in the 90s. I came of age in the 90s. I had very short hair. I was often taken for a boy. I was very androgynous. So, you know, I find it's so regressive, this ideology, because it's really entrenching these sex stereotypes. It's like, if you are, you know, short hair and play soccer and you're a girl, then you must be a boy. Like one of my twins, she just cut off her beautiful hair. She had this long blonde hair down to her waist, but it was heavy. It was getting knotty. She couldn't deal with it. So we chopped it all off, and we've sent the hair off to a wig maker who makes wigs for children with cancer. So she's done a really lovely thing, but she went off to school today, and the kids in the playground were calling her a boy, and they were saying that she had a Karen haircut. And I'm like, for God's sake. So I'm going to write a note to the teacher and just say, could you just be aware that, you know, she's had a haircut and they're not being very nice about it. I just thought, what's wrong with a girl having short hair? I don't understand. And then I've got my youngest. She wants to shave her head like Cressida in Hunger Games, and we've done it before, and it's all, her hair's halfway down her back now. She wants to shave it again. She plays rugby, you know, and I just say to her, she's actually said to me, I want to be a boy. I'm not a girl. And I said, well, why do you think that? She said, well, I don't want to be a girl because I don't want to have babies. And I went, sweetheart, you're like 5 years old. You don't have to decide that now. You decide when you're later, and you can change your mind too. That's also okay. You never can always change your mind. Everything's fine. But I thought, if I'd been a woke mum, I would have gone, oh, she said she's a boy. I best, ship her off to mermaids, and then where will we be?
And I'd be interviewing you about your bravery and coming forth about your child. Applause. That's what's happening too, right? Mm-hmm. You're getting a lot of very sick affirmation of parents who, I hate to say it, use their children for their own mental stability in a sense.
Yeah, look, I came across a few of those in the election campaign, and, someone saying that their 7-year-old son was actually a girl. And then I said to them, well, how do you know your child is trans? What did the doctor say? And the mother said, oh, I haven't taken my child to the doctor. And I'm like, so what, you diagnosed them on the internet? She didn't take very kindly to that. But I'm like, well, what are you doing? Just if your son wants to wear a dress and and grow his hair, just let him. He's 7. It doesn't mean that he's a girl. And you see the pathway that poor child will probably be on if he's being, because we know it's cascading, social affirmation, then you get to the gender clinic for the hormones and so on, and you just think, what's in store for that little boy? Maybe he's gay, maybe he's just gender non-conforming and he's going to grow out of it. But I think pathologizing it instead of just letting kids be kids, I just find it so alarming. And I think you're right, like we do see some of those parents, say like over in the States where you've got that little boy Kai Shapley, whose mother I think is a fundamentalist Christian in Southwest Texas. And, she even went on the record saying that she hit him when he was 2 years old and wanted to play with girls' toys. And I think he's the youngest of 5 boys. And now she's transitioned him, or dresses him and presents him as a girl. And, he's talking to, I think, the Texas Parliament. She's always wheeling him out in the media. And I just think, what happens when this kid wants to change his mind? But she's just put him out there. Like, how difficult would it be for that child to turn around and say, I think you've made a mistake, Mum?
You're listening to Savage Minds, and we hope you're enjoying the show. Please consider subscribing. We don't accept any money from corporate or commercial sponsors, and we depend upon listeners and readers just like you. Now, back to our show. These are like little Transturian candidates in a sense. And I'm shocked because Melbourne is known, for our listeners not familiar with Australia, for its university. It's a very left-leaning city, historically speaking, politically speaking. And between lockdown and this issue, I shake my head and I think this is a problem. And I'm very far to the left, but I have joined hands with people on the right around lockdown. And I do so, and this raises the next question for you, in fact, I do so because what we have been put through as a humanity on this planet, including where you and I are sitting right now, we were in the 2 worst spaces on the planet in the West to be in lockdown. I will never get over what I've been through, because when the Italian Parliament chose to lock people up and change forms that we had to print out that changed every other day, you never knew if you were printing out the latest form. Everything was a just massive cock up here to what was happening in Australia, with the camps included, Melbourne. And I've had many advocates from Melbourne on the show. I am very doubtful that these self-professed progressives are anything more than authoritarians, be it on the trans front, be it on the vaccine and COVID pandemic mitigation front. So when you say things like vilifying trans people is a crime, of course, because this has come down to no debate. It's come down to if you disagree, that is a crime. This isn't like gay bashing. When I was coming out, I was coming up and seeing stories of men and women being beaten. Now, that's a crime. You're saying my God doesn't accept your sexuality is, sorry, not a crime. I might not agree with it, but it does nothing to interfere with my right to live my life. And this is something that the gay lobby has jumped the shark on. And I'm someone who's very critical of the gay community. And I'll tell you why. I moved to New York in the late 80s. went to my first gay pride. I was very young. I was 21, liked gay pride. But after the first pride, they each in succession became more and more and more boring, more and more of the same. How many times can you see dykes on bikes? Okay, there are butch lesbians with Harleys. Okay, there are men in leotards with batons. Okay, there are men in dresses. I think that we have codified and ghettoized ourselves to such a degree that we helped, unfortunately and unwittingly in many cases, the trans lobby to advance itself. And I'm very critical of this. And I think a lot of other gay people are as well. Your thoughts?
Well, look, I think with LGBTIQ or pride, I'm not quite sure what to call it now, because it really has morphed into the TQ and the plus. But, the thing is they keep presenting themselves as the vulnerable, the oppressed, we're the counterculture. And I sit there and I think, well, no, actually, you guys are now the establishment. You guys are now you're not the counterculture anymore. Those of us, the conservatives literally are the counterculture now, because here in Australia, there is a group called ACON, which used to be the AIDS Council of New South Wales. They did very, very good work with respect to the AIDS epidemic back in the day. And I absolutely concur with how difficult it was back in the day for gays and lesbians. I have friends who are completely triggered by the word queer because they were queer bashed. I have a friend who was in the 78ers. So that's kind of like our Stonewall when what riots happened against the police. And then during the 80s and 90s when, gay bashing went on and there was a whole epidemic of young gay men being murdered or disappearing. They're actually holding an inquiry into that, which I completely agree with. And, having a gay sibling and just, worrying for their safety. And he recently did get punched in the face in New York City. It still happens, just minding his own business, walking down the street. And he was called names and then they punched him. So I totally understand that it goes on, but not to the same degree as it used to. It was back in the day when we were still fighting for gay and lesbian rights. And I think here in Australia, when we got the gay marriage through in 2017, which I voted for, where they changed, the definition of marriage to be not a woman and a man, but to be two people, that was kind of the last piece of the sort of legislative puzzle to put gay and lesbians on equal footing with everybody else. So I think probably other people prosecuted this argument, I'm sure, on your podcast, but it was like then they had to find something else to do and they pivoted. So ACON pivoted because I think there's, the numbers of people living with HIV in Australia are so small. And as a first world country, like I think it's even in the low thousands. And in a first world country, they have access to all the medications. So it's not a death sentence like it used to be. But they've really jumped on, ACON's now really jumped on board with pushing this trans narrative, and they've busied themselves with getting into every single government department, corporation, law firm, bank, education, into academia, into SBS, ABC, our big news broadcasters that are the state broadcasters, and embedding this worldview of gender identity into all their internal policies and external communications. And it's similar to Stonewall. They've actually modelled themselves on the Stonewall. I think it's Stonewall Diversity Champions. Yes. So we've been doing the same thing here. There's been a group led by Kit Kowalski putting in FOIs to see how deep this goes. And, we've got our tax department, our federal police department, ASIO, our spy department. They are all signed up to this. And they get points for, let's say, for instance, University of Melbourne is signed up, and we had a look at their FOI, and if you put in a person, I think they call them a gender officer or something like that, $100,000 for their salary. They don't necessarily have to have any particular qualifications, and basically they're just there to assist students to police anybody else who doesn't go along with their gender identity, and also to further embed the ideology into Melbourne University operations. So you get 2 points out of, I think it's a possible 200. But if you get any negative press against you on this issue, you lose 25 points. So it's this extraordinary sort of mechanism to get institutions and organisations and the government to comply to this. So, that's why we're seeing these extraordinary pieces of legislation. And speaking of Melbourne, they have the most draconian conversion therapy legislation, I believe, in the world. As I mentioned, you can have criminal sanctions up to 10 years, but it also creates a tribunal through the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. And so this is basically they appoint them. They're public servants that are appointed, not by the parliament. They're not voted on, but they will sit on this tribunal and they will decide if you're guilty of conversion or suppression practices. And then you will be, I think, fined, or if you don't decide not to show up to the tribunal, then they can take it to the police. I mean, it's just extraordinary. It's like a star chamber. Where they're able to impose these sanctions.
How is this even legal?
I know.
See, it seems it would be against any kind of democratic constitution because this isn't forced religiosity at the end. In fact, what you're explaining is really crazy making on the one hand, but I try to step back from it a bit and think of how this happened. And especially with your presence as a politician, you've seen a lot of things that the general public has not seen. And I posited in many of the episodes I've done with people working on this subject that we need to have some kind of oversight about NGOs that don't stop the mission once the problem is solved. And I say this, seeing what happened in Haiti, where you will see NGOs there not trying to end the problem of child trafficking, but moving the furniture around such that their nice, hefty salaries will continue. And there was a lot of fraud there. And even people from other NGOs called it out. And they said, this is just shifting the furniture around. We're not actually doing anything differently. The UN is culpable in this as well, very culpable. They send people over with the rank of P2 and P3 for 2 to 3 months. The continuum mission will always be there because no one has the historical memory to say, wait, we've been working on this same problem at this border with the Dominican Republic for the last 7 years because no one's been there for more than a few months. And that's how corruption happens, by continuing the mission. And what you pointed to, the gay rights charities. Yes, the minute Crixivan hit the market, 96, was when gay men, and at that point, AIDS was a heterosexual disease vastly, people were living with AIDS. It was treatable like diabetes. So these NGOs were allowed to stay in business using their already embedded contacts within government and private industry and other public agencies to then say, well, we're going to twist our narrative. And I feel very strongly that this has to end. These practices are ideological in nature. They have no basis in reality. I'm sorry, it's not like they said, well, let's keep working on men with AIDS, but we're going to, like Gay Men's Health Crisis in New York, we're going to not just be about men and not just about gay men. We're going to be about helping people living with AIDS get better housing. Okay, that's a valid thing. It's at least related. But not this, men in dresses are now pressuring lesbians to have sex with them, because that's what this is about. Or not about what Mermaids has done. Have you seen the recent scandal from yesterday with one of their other related agents who has penis pictures? It's really wild. It's like a kaleidoscope penis picture. And again, more pedophilic links. I'll go further. How can we have NGOs? Many in countries like the US, NGOs are tax bracketed. They don't have to pay full taxes, in certain cases none. So how is it that we have NGOs that are ideological churches without the God, as you said, able to have such expansive power, financial support, and then nothing is done to survey what they're doing? Because when you scratch the surface on this ideology, and it's going to be a bad look for all these people in even a year, Jon Stewart running his first show of the season, promoting gender transition for children. This is a guy whose work I've respected for years. I've lost all respect for him. He's promoting the destruction. You used a word earlier that a lot of trans advocates hate, but it is a mutilation. Taking off healthy breasts is mutilation. Having penectomies are mutilations. These are things that even young adults should not be doing, even if they're over the age of 18. I don't care. Where is the line for where the left is saying this is progressive to the right coming in? The right has saved us, in the right press as well, by the way. How is it that we're having this debate where the valences of left or right are completely distorted?
Oh, I agree. It's so confounding. Getting back to, pride being a neo-religion, it's almost like they are sacrosanct. I was told years ago by a politician when I first started speaking out, and they said, if you start talking out against some of these groups, they are the sacred cow. They will come after you. But, I look like in Melbourne, they've built this building, I urge you to look it up, called the Pride Centre. It looks like a cathedral with the progressive flag flying. It overshadows all the buildings as far as the eye can see. And the Victorian government spent $25 million building it. ACON they have a budget of about 20 million, and at least 13 of that comes directly from the taxpayer. And they've just been given, I think, about $4 million to open up a children's gender clinic at the big hospital here in Sydney. And, ACON, they've got this website called Trans Hub where they very much push the medicalisation of children, how to do it when your parents don't agree, what are your legal rights. If you are having issues, these are the lawyers you can go to. Here's a giant list of doctors that will transition you. And this is being paid for by the taxpayer, which is extraordinary. And I mean, the sad thing about this is that a lot of that money has actually come under the Liberal Party watch. We're in power here in the state of New South Wales. We're coming up to a state election where it's going to be very hard fought, but the Liberal Party in New South Wales has kind of just allowed this to happen under the radar. They haven't really sort of stood up against it, but they have a deal with an independent by the name of Alex Greenwich, who he pushed through the abortion reform legislation here in New South Wales, which I agree with. I'm very pro-choice, but it's pregnant people, not pregnant women. So he did that at the 11th hour, and now we're anticipating that he'll be pushing through the equality, what it would probably be called the Equality Act in New South Wales, that's going to enshrine, sex self-ID, where anyone can just walk into the registry and change their birth certificate to the opposite sex. They've done it in Victoria, so they have sex self-ID in Victoria already. You can do it on the basis of 2 statutory declarations, and you can change it every year if you like. Just go back and forth because it's fluid. Queensland and WA are looking at doing sex self-ID. Tasmania, I think they've got it as well. So it's just extraordinary that this is happening. We're pretty far gone here in Australia. And like with respect to the legislation, we had something called the Religious Discrimination Act that they were trying to pass at federal parliament before the election. And that is the only main human right that does not have specific legislation to protect it. So we've got like race and sex and disability, we've got aged for elder people, but religion is not specifically protected. And, I'm a lapsed Catholic, I'm happy to respect anyone's beliefs, but I think what we need here is to have like a belief discrimination bill almost, where, it covers religion and it covers belief, and it also covers freedom from religion and freedom from belief. I think that's maybe one way we could try to address the problems here, because, gender identity, it is a belief, as we've discussed. It's the belief in the gendered soul. It's the belief that you can be born in the wrong body, or having a bit of surgery will change your sex. And, I think, there's just a lot of people who don't go along with that, and we should not be facing criminal sanctions if we go along with that. So I think that it needs to be protected. So it's sort of similar to what happened with Maya Forstater, but in a different way.
And the irony is that only one side of the belief roster is allowed, because if gender identity is a belief, where is the belief as her rights were protected in the UK now because it's deemed a belief, but it's a bit more than a belief, our side. Our side is right. Their side is wrong. There is no science to back transgender ID. There is a psychiatric diagnosis, but even that, I've talked with people who say this also needs to be further debunked, in the sense of where in history has there been any psychiatric diagnosis, any psychological diagnosis, any diagnosis where the answer is that you, me, and the rest of the world has to say, you look smashing in that dress, Dolores. You're a real woman. None, none, none. There is not one. I've asked psychiatrists this. I asked people who work within transgender psychiatry this. There is no historical precedent for a diagnosis being resolved by not only that individual seeking out XYZ therapies or XYZ medical interventions, but where you and I must participate in the delusion. And this is why I think this is wrong, not only because you and I have the right to free thought and speech, but we know that sex is immutable. And that's at the basis of this. There is no scientific proof for this. And I'm a rational thinker. I'm a rational being, as are you, and as are all the other vagina havers listening to this. Because we have been demonized and reduced to our parts. And this is the paradox of this movement. They say, oh, you want to reduce us to our genitals. No, we're not running around calling you a penis haver. We're not running around saying anything other than that you're male. And I'm going to jump to a point that you're going to be able to relate to, I think. You and I, if I were to talk about other issues, we'll certainly disagree about. And I won't call your employer on you and say, hey, Katherine disagrees with me about this issue. This summer, you penned a piece called Erasing Women, Why Are Feminists Destroying Feminism? For The Spectator Australia.
Yes.
In which you analyze the political climate in the U.S. surrounding the overturning of Roe v. Wade. You write, in the 49-year hiatus since Roe was decided, those who would have once taken to the streets to champion women's rights grew complacent, lulled into a false sense of security. Those who traditionally stood for the advancement of women and their biological rights stopped fighting for women's right to physiological autonomy and safety, and instead, it seems, have occupied their time fighting for the rights of men to be women. End quote. Oh, I love that. Now, I love this piece because you get at the issue. Which feminism, you see? Because we've got the feminism, which I call pole dancing or sex worker feminism, where every woman who's a prostitute on the street is really doing so because she's empowered by this. Every woman who sleeks down on a pole for adult male entertainment, again, is empowered by doing this. How can the general public make sense of feminism when feminism is that which helped usher in this hokum in the first place, but it definitely was not the radical feminists saying men come into our hospital wards, changing room, growing squads, prison wards, etc. When so many women seem to be unable to suss out the difference between empowerment feminism, hence the sex worker pole dancing type, and the more, I don't even want to say radical feminist, because you don't have to be a radical feminist to know that men can't be women. You can actually not be a feminist at all. You can be a misogynist man who knows his biology. How do we get through this mire of what feminism is?
Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? Because, you know, here in Australia, we have, I call them the vichy feminists or the pick-me feminists, very high-profile women, some of whom have quite happily dogpiled me during the election, you know, who profess to be all about women, but are very on side with the trans narrative. And I just don't understand if they're doing it because they're ignorant, because they get, you know, woke cookies, or they're virtue signaling, or they're doing it because they see what happened to women who speak up like me and they don't want it to happen to them. I think, you know, I look at what happens in the UK, obviously, you know, Turf Island, they're sort of winning the fight. And I think like the history there in the UK with workers' rights and when they went through the Thatcher years, and because they're much smaller geographically, it's easier to get together and so on. So they have this history of, resistance, and it's easier to get together. I mean, we are so spread out here in Australia. It's a lot more difficult. And I think the fact that they've been able to highlight, the horror show of what trans activism can do, obviously with what's being exposed at Mermaids, which, as we know, whenever safeguards are reduced or removed for women and children, predators will be attracted. Of course they will. That goes without saying. Whereas here in Australia, we're a couple of years behind the UK. So I unfortunately think we're going to have to see some more and extreme examples of what trans activism does before the general public sort of get more mobilised. I thought it was going to be sport because we're such a sports crazy nation, but I think we need to have our own Leah Thomas or Laurel Hubbard. We are aware of sort of men competing in women's sports, but it's generally at the local level. So it's not quite high profile, but we're hosting the Olympics in 2032. And if we're going to have a Leah Thomas, take a spot away from one of our Golden Girl swimmers, Australians aren't going to be happy. We are now starting to get the story out that there are men who are convicted sexual predators in prisons here. So with what happened to me in the election, it has shifted the narrative a little bit because it got this argument on the table and now everyone is talking about it. Which is sort of all I'd ever wanted when I had been involved in that advocacy. So I think that, as just more and more stories come out, and it's just, you just can't turn a blind eye to it anymore. So the celebrities and the Vichy feminists and the media pundits here who are all rah-rah trans, I think there's going to be much sort of cleansing of timelines and denials that I said that, said, pro-trans things, but I don't know. I kind of feel, Julian, like it is going to get worse before it gets better in some of our countries.
This is why I raised the feminist issue with you, because my follow-up question to this is about the comment you made in that same article. You wrote, hands across the aisle almost seems like a quaint concept in the US. And I imagine you are referencing the ongoing debate here within the feminist community about left versus right. Where you talk about the Vichy feminists, but there's another thing going on here. There are the purity leftist feminists who have gone out of their way to monster a lot of the women who are not even on the right necessarily, but might be, who reach across the aisle. And I'm thinking specifically of Kelly J. King in the UK, who's been doing this work. Kara Dansky in the US, who works between the US and UK on Women's Human Rights Campaign, WHRC. And she's also been outspoken about the need to stop the purity politics, that we need to reach across the aisle because women on the right are, wait for it, women. And people vilified Kelly J. Keane early on. And I mean, specifically Women's Place UK. I love what they've done in many respects. I dislike what they did to her, however, simply because she had the temerity to say that the grooming gangs in the north of England were allowed to take place because the police were afraid to interfere for fear of being called racist. A claim that has now been backed up both by government commission and the police themselves. And they, from 2018, vilified her as a racist for saying something that was common sense, not at all racist. In the same way, if you say trans women are women, you're vilified as a bigot within the wider leftist scope. So I say this with great respect for Women's Place UK. Still, I have problems, and really deep problems, with the way that specifically Kelly J. King, aka Parker Posey, has been sidelined, defamed, and monstered all over social media, such that it's a very strange paradox when you have women in the States. They've never seen her, never saw her videos, but they heard by virtue of 100 mouths back on Twitter that she's a racist, therefore she must be a racist. What's up with the purity politics?
That's a really difficult one. I've always followed Kelly J. I admire her immensely. She has never resiled. She has never backed down. She speaks plainly. She doesn't make excuses. She's just focused on women and children. And I did see those claims of her against her that she was racist or that she was in bed with the the far right. And so I went to the source, like you. I went and looked it up. I thought, where are these claims coming from? And I think the far right one, she went to the Heritage Foundation. They had a venue and they platformed a mother whose children had been transitioned, and nobody else would. And she'd been fighting for years to be heard. And Kelly J went along to that, and she was vilified for that.
For sitting in the audience, by the way, right?
Yeah.
They were saying that she took money from the Heritage Foundation when in fact she did no such thing. And the day before, she actually went to DC because she and Julia Long and Megan Murphy, they organized something for women at the Washington, D.C. Public Library. So these feminists just took a story, balled it up into whatever they wanted, like throwing your underwear in the corner, I guess. And they were like, oh, she's paid by the Heritage Foundation, without doing a shred of investigation. As you did, I did the same.
Yeah, so I find it, sometimes I wonder, is it a bit of professional jealousy, perhaps, because Kelly J is so effective? But I don't know. With my feminism, I would say I go with the primitive type. I think, is this good for women and girls? And if it's not, then, it's not feminist, basically. I sort of go all the way back to that. But I think punishing women for having different views on certain things, I mean, this is what the other side want us to do. They want us to rip ourselves apart. And there have been quite a few disputes here in Australia amongst the feminists for differences of opinion and so on. And I just think we need to keep our eyes on the prize. Yes, we might have divergent views, say, about abortion or whatever it might be, but can we just set that aside? Because if we can't define what a woman is, if we can't win that fight, then the rest of it doesn't matter. So let's just join forces to fight this battle, and then we can go back to arguing about the other things. I'm sort of that view, and I just think that remaining, the purity politics and being so dogmatic, it also, I don't know, I think if you're not willing to consider other people's viewpoints, or even have a conversation with someone, like some of these people who are vilifying Kelly J, I know she's invited them to speak with her, and I think, why wouldn't you do that? Maybe you will realize you have more in common than you think. And yeah, sure, you might not agree on everything all the time, but it's not helpful to be smashing each other. Like, this is what the other side want us to do. They want us to tear ourselves apart, so we're fighting each other instead of fighting them. So I think we need to keep our eye on the prize, on the big picture here.
I agree. I think there's a lot of jealousy, professional jealousy as well, because what her tactic did, and I'm going to be completely transparent, when I started writing about this and Counterpunch would no longer run my pieces, which is a firmly leftist publication, I went to Public Discourse. The Public Discourse is a Heritage Foundation publication. Backstory to that is the Heritage Foundation was indirectly linked to the funding of the Contras in Honduras and Nicaragua during the 1980s. I received bullets from the Contras. Not in my body, but I dodged them. There was a day I had to, near Matagalpa, leave a bus with a bunch of other campesinos and hide behind rocks as we were being shot at. Now, I made the political decision to do the only thing I could do, which was to use the venues on the right, the publication venues, to print this. And people like, and I'll say their names now, but Julie Bindel and J. Claire Jones, who want to vilify Kelly J as being right-wing, are fooling themselves. Because even though one of these women publishes in a right-wing press, ironically, and will never admit that, the Daily Mail is not a progressive publication by any means. It's certainly not on the left. But the fact that you make your bread and butter from the right and then can turn around and speak out the other side of your mouth about someone who's simply organizing and having mothers whose children have been mutilated by these processes, I can see who's being regressive and totalitarian here, and it's not Kelly J. And I have issues with having this plan. It's not a good optic. Where are we heading? As if, who voted for you to lead us? I mean, we're not on Star Trek, and you're not Captain Kirk. So I don't know why these women have the arrogance outside of their professional esteem and PhDs, but they believe themselves to have the acknowledgement and they have been tapped to lead us. Kelly J has succeeded because she hasn't done that. She involves all women. Everyone at her events is allowed to come up to the mic. It's like open mic night. It's karaoke political. And you can go and talk. And they don't do that. I've seen their Twitter feed before I was banned, and it's about their egos, they're being platformed. And I rather find it interesting that the person who succeeded the most is the one with the working class background, the one who's platformed women of working class backgrounds, extremely poor women, single mothers, same-sex couples. She's not homophobic. She's not racist. She's platformed everyone and anyone who wants to be platformed. She's asked these women, including Kathleen Stock, to come on her show to have a discussion. And you're right. I think these women should take it up, because their argument all these years about the trans debaters who won't debate is, well, they don't want to debate us because they know that we'll show them up within a few questions. And I have to say, I have the same suspicions about their refusal to go on her show and discuss with her. Because as a leftist, and I'm very hard left, I cannot square myself with having said no to publishing my pieces to get the word out simply because I was going to play a purity politics against the Heritage Foundation, an organization I have a particular ire for, personally speaking, and for those people I love and know in Nicaragua. But if this helped get the word out, so be it at this point. You know what I mean?
Yeah, well, Kelly has been extremely effective. And I know, some of these other women that you have mentioned have been, they have PhDs. They've been writing about this for decades. And maybe Kelly J has just had more of an impact with her message than they have. So maybe it is a bit of professional jealousy. I'm not entirely sure. It's a strange one. But I think, if Julie was to have a chat with Kelly J, I mean, that would be huge within this world. Many people would watch it. And it's funny that you mentioned those two, because I've been going on to Sky News regularly a couple of times a week. And they've been fantastic. So Rowan Dean, who's the editor of The Spectator Australia. So if you ever have a piece, Julian, I can ask Rowan if he'll run it. But I was on his show on Sky News, and one week we had Julie Bindel, and we were talking about the lesbians who were attacked in Leeds, and also at that other Pride event where they were chucked out of the march. And then the following week, we had Kelly J on there talking about what happened in Brighton. So, it almost seemed like, they're fighting the same battle, but they're just doing it differently. And I think just focusing on, maybe trying to undermine someone else's work, it's just not very helpful. But in mentioning Rowan and in being on Sky News, also there's Paul Murray, who has his show 4 nights a week. I mean, getting back to way back in the beginning of this conversation, the support that I've had from men and conservative men. Me running in the election, I could not have done this without my partner. And he is, I suppose you call him an alpha male. He works in a heavily male-dominated industry. I don't think there's even any women working in it. He's an ex-police officer. And, I speak to him, I speak to his workers, and they are all on side with this. They all have daughters. They all completely get it. They all think it's just ridiculous, and they seem to sort of start arcing up when you talk about the impact it might have on their wife and daughters. And then when I was running in the election, some of my biggest supporters were conservative men, older conservative men who completely believed in what I was saying, who gave me opportunities to speak, who donated, who organised events with really high profile people so I could get my message out. So it's interesting that, even though this is all about women and children, we seem to have this whole cohort of males who are completely on side, who just, won't go along with the ideology at all. And then, as you pointed out, we've got these, really sort of lefty women who, are sort of distracting themselves by arguing with other women about how they're running their advocacy. Because at the end of the day, like we're all, I mean, I do this, I don't get paid for any of this. I don't get paid to be on the telly. I don't get paid for my articles. I do this because I'm driven to do it. Nothing would stop me from fighting for this. And, so many of us have given, hours and years of our lives to fighting in this space without any recompense, without any desire for awards or adulation, and we're all sitting here fighting our own battles. And I think that if you're trying to undermine someone when they're just trying to engage in the fight in their own way, it's just not very productive.
Well, where do you see this heading? Because you say it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I can see that. I can see that because even though you have LGB Alliance, we had that moment of Schadenfreude about 10 days ago when it was announced that because mermaids instigated an investigation by the Charity Commission to have them de-charitized, I made that word up, but the irony is that they've brought it on themselves. Now they're being investigated by the Charity Commission, both because of breast binders and some testimony that they are rushing parents into this process. There's much more. There was a case I covered for Feminist Current in 2016 around their pressuring another parent in terms of transitioning their child that went to court. Mermaids has a lot to answer for in terms of being basically a backdoor gay conversion therapy laboratory. And we need to say it for what it is, because the vast majority of these boys and girls going through their doors are simply gay boys and lesbians.
Yeah.
That can't be stated enough. I think that we're going to be seeing backlash on this. Did you see the women on Twitter the other day defending the trustee from Mermaid, saying, well, he did that when he was much younger and it was only one article, it was only one conference. And I'm thinking,
No.
OMFG, these are the same people saying it's okay that a rapist is in a woman's prison because it's his identity. He has to live his true self. Since when has the left become the political wing of advocating for personal identity of rapists? I want to know when that happened, because I have friends in the US who have confessed to me that they are voting, and they're very far left again, they are voting Republican all the way through this fall.
Yeah, I'm hearing that too. People who are going to be, or people who voted Liberal in our election. I've heard that as well with the Republicans over in the United States. And I think, I don't know, I think like here in Australia, there's going to need to be more litigation. There's going to need to be cases like there has been in the UK. And I'm sure that they are coming. And I think that we'll probably also have an inquiry eventually into what they're doing to children. I've spoken to someone who's sort of very high up in that world, and it's only a matter of time before they have an inquiry into the gender clinics here. And I think also, you know, in the pushback, it'll come from parents. Like in the United States, obviously, when they're seeing their kids being indoctrinated into critical race theory and gender identity ideology, and they're pushing back at all those school board meetings, and the parents are starting to revolt. Whereas here in Australia, it hasn't really come out as much. I mean, I've got my kids coming home telling me about, you know, there's a program that they watch and they were pushing the presenter who was a trans man, and they have this day called Wear It Purple, which is essentially just, you know, spreading the LGBTIQ ideology. And they say, oh, it's an anti-bullying program, but they don't actually do anything. It's just a day where you have to demonstrate your allegiance. But all this stuff is creeping into the curriculum here in Australia. And I think when parents start to see what's happening, and that there will start to be a pushback. But we're probably, as I said, 2 to 3 years behind the UK. So it's going to take a little bit more time. I think it's going to take some more of these stories coming out like they have in the UK before people really start to mobilise and push against it. But Julian, I mean, I'm just confounded as to how we found ourselves in a position where people are actually, you know, defending someone who is very openly pro-pedophile and has been repeatedly for years involved in a children's charity. I think there probably will be some really far-reaching inquiries or a royal commission to see how this ideology actually managed to infect every single institution and organisation.
And I'm also worried about the many people out there, and you know they are there. I hear them all the time. They don't understand the difference between transgender and gay. They are so out of it that they're just like, oh, you people with your gender sexual business. So this is going to result in gay men who are not actually supporting any of this bollocks being gay bashed, including also gay women being beaten up, because we are viewed as having ushered this forth. We are viewed as being that gateway to hell. And I'm worried about our rights now, because people say, well, now you have a fascist in Italy. And I'm like, well, look at your clock a little bit. Because while some people had paychecks the whole time through lockdown, Italians were locked up in the most cruel way. I mean, it's surprising that Mussolini wasn't raised from the dead and voted into power. I don't blame people for putting her into power. I certainly am not pro Meloni, but politics is a zero-sum game in the sense of people vote with what their life experience has been months before they go to the voting booth. And the last almost 3 years, people have lived hell in Italy from lockdown. And the gender ideology madness, called the Zan law, Legge Zan, has come up as well. So they had this double whammy of quackery in two fronts from the left. During lockdown, we were treated to La Repubblica that ran similar to The Guardian, 10 things you can do with your children during lockdown. Meanwhile, the majority of people in Italy were having no time to do homeschooling and work and eat and sleep. This is insane. So yes, the left needs to go in the back room and have a chat with themselves. They need to abandon all of what they've been preaching, because this is madness, not just the pedophilia angle. I wrote about this just last week in my expose on the LSE and what I went through as a pregnant candidate for an LSE position as a professor there. I spoke out because this bullshit of mermaids not knowing that their trustee dude was pro-pedophile is a big lie. Google exists, Dogpile exists. You can go back and find everything. And
it's implausible.
And the whole university, the LSE, is caught up in gender ideology because it's a very convenient way of removing us from the scene. I was an inconvenient presence once that committee saw I was pregnant. I was a very inconvenient presence for them. Yet, isn't it convenient to have all women shortlists with Eddie Izzard on there? You can have men that never menstruate or have children take up my position. Maybe a man got the post that I was denied. This is a real problem where gender ideology, I'm using this word, no offense to you, but in the most conservative world, and when I say conservative, I'm not thinking your party, I'm thinking of where people said things once upon a time that if Jesus wanted us to have cars, he would have put wheels on our feet. I'm talking about that kind of stuff that I heard when I grew up in the deep South in the US. I think the left needs to have a serious debate as to why they've abandoned historical materialism, for starters, the working class. I had to tune into Fox News to get any news about the working class because CNN wasn't doing it, as they were flouting stay home and clap for the healthcare workers. Okay, so we really are in a mess when we have the right doing the work that the left has long abandoned. It's quite a paradox where the right is almost the new left in a way.
That's right. Like here in Australia, the Liberal Party, now we're attracting, what we call the aspirational Australians and the working class Australians, because Labor's sort of abandoned them. Labor's sort of the party of the elite, like it is in America with the Democrats. It's the people in the East Coast cities who vote Democrat. We call it post-materialist. The people who vote based on virtue signaling, not on, the cost of living or the reality of their lives. So, there has been this sort of real inversion. It's quite extraordinary. And a lot of people just feeling politically that they're not aligned necessarily politically. A lot of swing voters now, whereas people used to be sort of firmly Labor or Liberal, but we've had more independents and more small parties gaining the vote, which is somewhat problematic because we are based on the Westminster system. It's a two-party preferred system. So when we start having all these independents and these small parties, it starts to become unwieldy. You only have to look at Italy or Spain or Germany and how it's almost ungovernable because you don't have a party that's able to form a majority government. The political landscape is really, I don't know, it's all sort of, it's all a big muddle. But I think, like with the Liberal Party here, they're not standing up enough with respect to this gender ideology. And I think if they did, they're sort of struggling. We have most of the states have a Labor government now. We have a Labor government federally. But I think that, if you have a party that's just willing to talk sense and talk to common sense and be willing to protect the safeguards for women and children, it's a golden opportunity for that party to win government. Because we're going to be seeing more of this woke stuff. Like we've got Labor, Greens, Teal in power at the moment, and they're going to go off the reservation with the woke stuff, not just with gender ideology, but also like critical race theory. They're going crazy with climate change, with putting in solar panels and wind turbines, to the point where we won't be able to have reliable baseload power. So we'll end up like Europe and having rolling blackouts. We still haven't realised that transitioning from fossil fuels to renewables, we need to do it in an orderly fashion, so we don't end up like Germany, reliant on a country that they're potentially going to go to war with. Yeah, so I think we need to see some of these things happen before the people sort of wake up and think this has just gone too far. Can't we just get back to, what's important?